I tolerated disrespect for so long that I stopped recognizing it as disrespect and started experiencing it as the normal texture of my relationships. And the moment I understood that the normalization was the most serious damage the tolerance had done was the moment I understood that the tolerance had to end. My name is Patricia. I am 67 years old, and I want to talk to you about something that I believe affects more women than will readily admit it, and that costs more than most women fully understand until the cost has been paid across enough years to make the full accounting unavoidable. I want to say first that what I am describing is not the dramatic and obvious disrespect that most people recognize immediately as the thing requiring address. The dramatic and obvious version is real, and it deserves the immediate and uncompromising response it requires, and I am not minimizing it. What I am describing is the quieter version, the accumulated and incremental and sometimes barely perceptible version that does not arrive dramatically but accumulates across months and years of the small and daily interactions that shape the interior architecture of a relationship and that reveal themselves as disrespect only when you have accumulated enough of them to see the pattern rather than the individual incident. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the second of three daughters, in a household that modeled for me in the specific and daily way that households model things, the relationship between women, and the expression of their own needs and boundaries that I absorbed without examination and reproduced without recognition across the first 40 years of my adult life. My mother was a woman who managed everyone's comfort at the expense of her own, with the specific and habitual self-erasure of someone who had been taught that the good woman was the accommodating one and who had practiced the accommodation so thoroughly that she had stopped distinguishing it from the genuine expression of her own preferences. I became her. Not in the dramatic and conscious sense, but in the organic and unremarked sense of a daughter who had been given a model and who reproduced it because the model was what she had, and because the questioning of it would have required the courage that the model specifically did not cultivate. The disrespect accumulated across my marriage, across my workplace relationships, across my friendships, across my relationships with my two children as they became adults, in the specific and varied forms that disrespect takes when it is not the dramatic single event, but the pattern of the accumulated small ones. The interrupting, the dismissing, the patronizing assumption that my assessment of things required the correction of someone whose confidence in their own judgment was not proportional to its accuracy. The plans changed without consultation. The time treated as the available resource of whoever needed it rather than the finite and personal possession of the person it belonged to. The opinions offered without invitation and received as though the offering required my gratitude rather than my considered response. Each of these things in isolation was manageable. The managing of them in isolation was the mechanism by which the pattern was sustained, because the managing of each incident as an isolated incident, rather than as the expression of a pattern, prevented the pattern from being seen as the pattern it was, and therefore prevented the response that the pattern required. I want to tell you the 5 ways I took back control, not as the prescription of a self-help program, but as the honest account of what actually worked for me across the years since I understood what I was dealing with and decided to address it. The first way is the naming of what is happening in the moment it is happening rather than after it has happened and after the moment for the direct response has passed. I spent decades processing disrespect retrospectively, understanding what had occurred in the quiet of my own interior hours after the occurrence, and arriving at the accurate assessment of what it had been after the opportunity to address it directly had closed. The retrospective processing is the mechanism that allows disrespect to accumulate without consequence because the consequence that would have addressed it in the moment arrives too late to serve the purpose it was supposed to serve. I learned to name things in the moment, not with the aggressive confrontation that the fear of the naming had always suggested would be required, because the actual naming, practiced with the calm and direct quality that the genuine confidence in one's own assessment allows, does not require aggression. It requires the specific and simple statement of what is occurring. You interrupted me, and I want to finish my thought. That is not something I am comfortable with, and I need you to stop. I have a different view of this, and I want it to be heard. These sentences are available in the moment, and they do not require the preparation of a lengthy confrontation, and they change the dynamic of the interaction in ways that the retrospective processing does not change it. The second way is the distinction between the relationships that have the genuine capacity to receive the naming and change in response to it, and the relationships that do not have that capacity. This distinction is the most important and the most consistently avoided of the five because making it honestly requires accepting a conclusion about some of the relationships in your life that the attachment to those relationships has been preventing you from accepting. I have relationships that changed when I began naming things. The people in those relationships received the naming with the specific and genuine discomfort of someone who had not realized what they were doing and who, when it was made clear, had the capacity and the intention to change. Those relationships are the better for the naming, and I am grateful for both the naming and the change. I have relationships that did not change when I began naming things. The people in those relationships received the naming with the resistance of someone who had organized the relationship around the dynamic the naming was challenging and who was not willing to reorganize it. Those relationships required a different response, which was not the escalation of the naming, but the genuine reassessment of the investment those relationships deserved, given their demonstrated capacity, and the reassessment produced in several cases the reduction of the investment to the level appropriate for the relationship's actual quality rather than the relationship's assumed potential. The honest distinction is the beginning of the taking back of control, because the control cannot be taken back from every relationship simultaneously, and the attempting to take it back from the relationships that do not have the capacity to receive it is the exhausting of the energy that the relationships that do have the capacity most need. The third way is the recovery of the no that the tolerance had made unavailable. I want to describe the no carefully because I think it is both the simplest and the most charged of the five ways, and because the charging of it is itself the evidence of the damage that the tolerance has done to the person's relationship with her own refusal. The no that I am describing is not the aggressive no of someone who has decided to refuse everything in the service of the performance of her recovered autonomy. It is the simple and genuine no of a person who has a preference about what she is willing to do and who expresses that preference with the directness that the preference deserves. The no that is said clearly and without the elaborate justification that the tolerance has trained you to believe is required for the no to be acceptable is the specific and daily practice of the reclamation of your own authority over your own time and your own energy and your own life. The people who receive your genuine no with respect are the people whose yes means something. The people who receive your genuine no with the pressure and the guilt and the management of your boundaries that the tolerance has trained you to accept are the people whose relationship to you has been organized around the availability of the yes and who are revealing that organization in the response to the no. The fourth way is the rebuilding of the internal standard against which the external treatment is measured. The tolerance I described at the beginning produces the normalization of the treatment it tolerates, and the normalization means that the internal standard against which the treatment is being unconsciously measured has been adjusted downward to accommodate the treatment rather than the treatment being held to the standard that it should be held to. The rebuilding of the internal standard requires the honest examination of what you actually deserve in the specific relationships of your actual life, not the abstract standard of what people in general deserve, but the specific and personal standard of what this person with this history and these capabilities and this full and particular self deserves in the relationships that are supposed to serve that self's genuine well-being. The examination is uncomfortable because the honest assessment of what you deserve and the honest assessment of what you have been receiving are assessments that the tolerance has been preventing you from making simultaneously, and the making of them simultaneously is what produces the understanding of the gap that the tolerance has been normalizing. You deserve more than you have been accepting. I want to say that directly and without the qualification that the politeness of the statement might seem to require, because the directness is the point and the qualification would soften the directness into something more comfortable and less useful. You deserve more than you have been accepting. The standard that the tolerance has normalized is not the accurate standard, and the accurate standard is higher, and the raising of the internal standard to the accurate level is the beginning of the external insistence on the standard that the raising makes visible. The fifth way is the development of the community of people who demonstrate rather than merely describe the respect that you are learning to require. I want to include this fifth way because I think the four previous ways are more available and more sustainable in the presence of the evidence that the thing you are working toward is real and achievable, and that the people who offer it genuinely are findable. I found women in my late 50s who had done the work I was doing and who had arrived at the specific and genuine quality of mutual respect that the work produces, women who were interested in my actual thoughts rather than in the performance of my agreeableness, who said true things to me rather than comfortable ones, who received my no without the pressure that the tolerance had normalized, and whose yes therefore carried the weight of a genuine choice rather than the weight of the absence of a genuine refusal. The finding of them changed what I understood was possible, and the changing of what I understood was possible changed what I was willing to accept in the relationships where the standard had been lower than the possibility the finding had revealed. I am 67 years old. The 60 years that preceded the understanding cost me things I cannot recover and produced in me an understanding I would not trade for the recovery. And the understanding is what I am offering you today with the specific and direct honesty that the subject requires. You are not required to tolerate disrespect, not from the person you have been tolerating it from the longest, and not from the person whose relationship to you feels too important to risk with the direct address of what the relationship is doing to you, and not from the person whose response to the direct address you are most afraid of. The fear of the response is not the reason to continue the tolerance. The fear of the response is the evidence of the extent of the damage that the tolerance has done to your confidence in your own right to require better treatment. You have the right. You have always had the right. Use it. Start with the next moment it is needed. Name what is happening. The naming is the beginning, and the beginning is available right now.